Hey guys, this is Robert Breedlove from the What is Money show. And as you've learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to facilitate financial security for all. They accomplish this by bringing a high level of professionalization and sophistication to the Bitcoin marketplace. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. By using NYDIG, you will gain access to an end-to-end institutional-grade platform, providing Bitcoin OTC transactions, Bitcoin collateralized borrowing, secure custody, asset management, derivatives, financing, market research, and more. And all of these services meet the highest regulatory, governance, and audit standards. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and is leading the way for ongoing institutional adoption in this nascent asset class. So please be sure to check out NYDIG as a single source for all your Bitcoin needs. So I want to drill into this a little bit more, this game theory all the way down topic. Have you heard of universal Darwinism?
It sounds like a kind of Dan Dennett concept.
I think it may be related to him. I don't know a lot about it. I read Hoffman's book, The Case Against Reality.
Okay.
Don't know that one. He talked a bit about it. But so if it is game theory all the way down, then basically everything is a strategy, right? Life is a strategy. An organization is a strategy. It's just a whole collection of these iterated games. So then everything is a player or a strategy, I guess you might say. And I'm reading a book recently too on quantum physics, and it's making the point that even at the subatomic level, reality responds to us, how we measure it, like what the intention of the experimenter is, reality changes. So I was just curious, like, does this weigh in on your metaphysical views, this idea of game theory all the way up and all the way down?
It's a rabbit hole that once you go down a sort of game theoretic strategic perspective on reality, you never really entirely leave it.
Yeah.
And it sounds like kind of a depressing Machiavellian way to live. But that's only true if you focus on really simple, depressing kind of zero-sum games.
Right.
It's like strictly competitive and there's a definite winner and a loser. But once you get a little more sophistication about this stuff, then you realize almost nothing in life is strictly zero-sum.
Right.
There's like almost every way that real people actually interact, or firms interact, or married people interact.
Yeah.
There's always potential for not necessarily positive sum interactions and mutual gains, but if nothing else, like at least minimizing mutual damage.
Yes.
Yeah. And so we're constantly living in a state of what the game theorists call mixed motive games, where there's like some incentives for cooperation, there's some incentives for selfishness and competition, there's some degree of kind of tension between short and long-term interests, there's some social context that's kind of watching everything that's going on and kind of evaluating all the players, because the players are rarely on a deserted island.
Yeah.
And so to me, the further and deeper I got into kind of game theory thinking, in a way, kind of the more optimistic I got about human relationships and social life, because you just see many more potentials for mutually beneficial interactions.
Right.
You understand the markets a lot better. And also,
Yes.
I think you understand like crypto a lot better.
Yes. Yeah. Agree. Well, you're front running me here. You know where I'm taking it. So capitalism, clearly that is the implementation of a positive sum game, writ large, basically for humans. So we effectively say, if we can each go out and do our own thing and have rights to the property we create, we take our own personal property, we infuse it with nature, we create something of value and trade it with other self-owned people, that we create this incredible positive sum game called capitalism, where we create a bunch of wealth. We all become richer. Life becomes easier. We have more freedom, effectively. And so it's not, I agree with you that you hear game theory, people tend to think zero sum immediately. It's always like, if I got something, you lost something. And maybe that's conditioning from the game of Monopoly or something. I'm not sure. But to your point, it's quite often positive sum rather than zero sum. And I've also found that when you come to perceive the game theoretic aspects of money, that to me is the core of seeing Bitcoin as, I don't want to use the word inevitable, but as very likely. Because the game theory, again, if it's game theory all the way down, it's all the way up as well. Governments are playing games between one another. There's geopolitical games being played, political games, organizational games, corporate games. That they're, so long as they are organizations or organisms that want to trade to produce wealth and then conserve that wealth in something that can't be diluted, Bitcoin, although it's adopted by choice, in some ways is forced upon all market actors over time. Is game theory very fundamental to your perception of this as well?
Yeah, totally. Because if you think about the set of problems that Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever he, she, they, it, was, the set of problems that they solved were fundamentally game theoretic problems of how do you coordinate action and value and trust in a kind of trustless world using this magic of cryptography. And in a way, Bitcoin almost like solved too many problems all at once for people to really appreciate the genius of it.
Right.
Because if it had been like, here's a way to solve the double spend problem alone, and then people had been like, had taken like 10 years to appreciate, okay, that's cool. And then if like Bitcoin part 2 is introduced, like, here's how we can do proof of work and mining in a way that makes it like hard to fake the value of this, then people would be like, oh, that's really cool. Like, then they take another 10 years to appreciate that. But in a way, the fact that so many kind of game theoretic problems about value were solved all at once in 2009 means that for the people who get it, like, they become very, very enthusiastic about it. And the people who don't get it, like, haven't quite had the time or, the kind of intellectual elbow room to kind of catch up. And, but I think the same is true for lots of other innovations in the crypto space. And there have been innovations. And, Bitcoin like solves a certain set of problems, and other projects might solve other problems. But it's happening so quickly that the problem of cultural lag is really severe. It's like it takes a couple generations traditionally for people to kind of wrap their heads around a major new way to solve a trust issue or an economic issue.
Right.
Like the concept of like depositing your money in a bank instead of just keeping it in your house.
Yeah.
It took a while for people to get comfortable with that.
Right.
Or the concept of like, I'm going to give money to this entity, this corporation that has limited liability and trust that they will give me dividends in the future. And like, normally there's a certain speed of progress that people are kind of used to, and it's multi-generational, and like, you don't really trust it unless you grow up with it.
Yeah. Right.
Crypto is so new that we've had like barely half a generation to kind of wrap our heads around it. And so we don't even fully appreciate how many game theoretic problems have been solved or might be solved by these kinds of technologies.
Such a great point, because so many early adopters in Bitcoin, people that get it, I mean, they grew up playing video games. They grew up on digital technology. So we became very, myself included, became very accustomed to having these real interactions online. But then in the video game world, like the games I played, they actually had money in the games too. And so the money functioned, the game, you could trade with other real life people in real time. And there was a later point where the items in that game started being sold on eBay for what, quote unquote, real money, as in US dollars. So that left, a very fundamental mark on me. It's like, okay, the digital space is kind of the future of commerce because it just offers so many advantages. But so growing up with that, it's a natural extension for me to be like, oh yeah, Bitcoin makes sense. But if you didn't grow up with that, you didn't grow up with digital existence, then it's much harder maybe to accept. And to your point too, I like the point about Bitcoin solving so many problems. The big breakthrough, the Byzantine generals problem, that's a game theoretic problem. So how do you pass a message across an antagonistic group of actors and have the message maintain its fidelity, like without getting distorted? So yeah, it's so, I feel like that is the most fundamental, I don't know if you call it an epistemology to understand Bitcoin. Like it is just where it really grounds out. When you come to see the game theory propelling it in the world is when I came to see it as unstoppable. It's like you can't quit the game. You can't step outside the game. You can't pause the game. So it's like, you have to play the game. If you have to play the game, then, and you want to trade and you want to conserve wealth, you want to be a successful economic agent, then you have to hold the hardest money.
Yeah, and I also, of course, the hacker ethos, which is like, you only really are confident that your system is secure if you take the point of view of the hacker trying to break into it and trying to be adversarial. And this system is only as secure as like the number and quality of iterations between you and potential adversaries. And you cannot possibly in advance from first principles predict all the possible attack vectors.
Right.
You actually have to at least simulate them, or at least recruit people to be like play adversaries rather than real adversaries. You see the same thing with deep learning, machine learning, alpha, zero. These systems now can train themselves up to beat the world champions at chess or Go just by playing themselves adversarially, repeatedly, millions and millions of times. And so I think there's a new concept of how do you create genuine trust and security, that you have to go through the crucible of kind of adversarial game theoretic testing. And I suspect that's also something that crypto people and Bitcoiners kind of get intuitively at this point. Like they're always questioning, how could you break this money? How could you break this crypto? How could you attack it? Could you do a 51% attack? Could you like dominate the stakeholder pool? Like, what could you do? And that is rarely done with traditional fiat currency in any kind of systematic way, apart from like, the Secret Service will hire like a material scientist to go, how hard is this dollar bill to counterfeit? But they won't ask, like, what's to keep the government itself from kind of counterfeiting it?
Yeah.
Right, through money printing. Or what's to keep some actual geopolitical adversary from doing a sort of financial warfare attack
on
our system. And so I think once you go from kind of a naive, non-game theoretic view into like a slightly cynical game theory view, you're sacrificing the illusion of security for actual potential security.
Right. Yeah, it's tell me, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this too. So Bitcoin solves the Byzantine generals problem. right? We propagate a message through all of us antagonistic actors, and it's done with true fidelity, right? Whatever is cemented in the blockchain, 6 blocks back, we all agree to that. Consensus is established. It's inarguable, effectively. It was brought to my attention once that the solving of the Byzantine generals problem can really only be done once, in a way. Like, you would always rely on that system for the system that could propagate the most truthful message, because it's never certain, right? It's all probabilistic. The probabilities just go way into the, astronomical territory. And it was brought to my attention that the only way to successfully stop Bitcoin at a geopolitical level would actually be full collective concerted action by every nation state simultaneously, right? They would have to all outlaw it in the same way. They would have to disparage it. They'd probably have to render physical attacks on both the mining network and on Bitcoiners themselves. Like, it would take a complete concerted, unidirectional effort, if you will, on the part of all governments acting worldwide. Because if there were any non-participants, then that business could very easily move to those jurisdictions effectively, because capital is hypermobile, et cetera, et cetera. So the weird conundrum here is, like, for geopolitical actors to stop Bitcoin, they themselves need to solve the Byzantine generals problem, right? They need to have this trusted message so they can all follow one unitary plan to stop Bitcoin. But the very solution to that problem is the thing they're trying to stop, which is Bitcoin. So that was presented to me once as like the impossibility of stopping Bitcoin, because it had already solved the one thing that could possibly stop it.
I think at a kind of narrow technical level, that might be correct. However, the problem is human psychology and virtue signaling again, which is like, if you are a deeply manipulative, like Machiavellian nation state or firm or whatever, and let's say hypothetically you want to destroy some new technical innovation, whether it's Bitcoin or email or driverless cars or anything, right? The way you do it, pragmatically speaking, is propaganda that hits people's moral hot buttons and that makes it seem socially unacceptable at an ethical level to be associated with the new technology. Okay? So some hostile nation state, they could spend potentially like tens of billions of dollars trying to like dominate Bitcoin manufacturing or whatever. But the cheaper way to attack any given crypto project would be guilt by association, with the founders, the investors, the advocates, et cetera. You just do a propaganda war. And it's not that hard to convince people that there's moral taboo X that everybody agrees is bad, like, child pornography or whatever. And then you just draw some dotted lines between the bad thing everyone agrees is bad and the thing you want to attack as a kind of psyop, right? Where you want to create the impression that it's deeply uncool and unethical to be associated with that thing in any way. And we've seen many, many nation states throughout history do those kind of like virtue signaling psyops to attack, disparage, discredit people, groups, technologies, etc. And that attack vector, the virtue signaling attack vector, is often incredibly cheap and effective.
Interesting.
And honestly, that's the thing that often keeps me up at night. It's not that like, US senators will like figure out, if we give an extra few $1 billion of R&D money to NSA, that NSA will be able to like crack Bitcoin cryptography with some new quantum computer. That's not the issue. The danger is like US senators figure out, well, hell, I can get reelected if I just, disparage Bitcoin as being something used by those ne'er-do-wells.
Right.
And then it's really hard to fight those ethical attack vectors. And, the nation states that ban certain kinds of crypto are basically doing that, right? They're saying, like, you're not a good citizen.
Right.
From our point of view, we're going to create a social norm that says, if you invest in crypto, you're a bad, bad person.
Yeah.
And you're betraying the motherland or whatever. And that is not a problem that can be solved through pure game theory at the technical level. It's something where, like, you've got to build your kind of propaganda defenses, your lobbying power,
right,
your PR, your friendly journalists. Like, you've got to have that cultural immune system protecting you.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does a lot. So this is very interesting, because I think the propaganda on Bitcoin, it's already started to some extent, but I think it's going to get worse with the environmental impact, the energy usage. That's an area that is so ill understood and such a glaring thing about Bitcoin. That's something they could hone in on very simply. Then the defense against these ethical attack vectors is counter propaganda, effectively, or you could maybe say education. If you're telling the truth, it's more like education, less like propaganda. How would we? Because I guess 2-part question: how could a psyop to stop Bitcoin succeed, and then what ethical defenses would be most effective at stopping it?
Well, one obvious ethical attack vector is from the kind of woke far left. And you have to anticipate that there will sooner or later be attacks on crypto on the basis that it is, racist or white nationalist, that it's sexist, that it's male dominated, that it's Western European, that it's colonialist and exploitative, that it is, heteronormative in some way. Like, any of those accusations that kind of woke politics is used to kind of hurtling in all directions at anybody they don't like, easy to weaponize those against crypto. Because as a matter of fact, crypto industry is overwhelmingly like white, Asian, largely male, middle class, Euro-American. At least it's perceived to be that way. And I think crypto needs to start developing defenses against that in a much more serious way. It's not enough to say, trust us, this is liberating, and trust us, this is good for poor people and rich people, and this will be good for everybody around the world. Like, whatever you think, for example, whatever you think about Cardano, I think one genius of the project is focusing on that Africa strategy that says, here are concrete ways this will be good for ordinary poor people in Africa, and will help them create economic identity for them. Or you need to start practicing your talking points and your counter narrative that says, here's why crypto would be good for empowering disenfranchised women around the world, whatever, the apostate women of Afghanistan who might want to actually escape that country perhaps now with maybe some of their family wealth intact. How are they going to do that if their export controls on money? Maybe crypto could help empower them. We need to develop an armory of these kinds of counter narratives, and I think we have to do it proactively.
So what do you think the PSYOP, if it were to be successful, what would it look like? Because in my opinion, and I don't know, may or may not agree with this, if Bitcoin fails, the whole thing fails. That's like there's one asset so far that's provably resistant to all attack vectors that we've seen thrown at it. If, the king fails, so to speak, then I think it's going to render most of the movement, if not all of it, to similar attack vectors, and it just won't work. What in your mind, you said it keeps you up at night thinking about it, like what flavor of PSYOP do you think could actually destroy Bitcoin?
I hate giving ideas to like the feds for what sort of an actionable attack strategy they could use, but it would involve things like, look, like all state intelligence agencies that are sophisticated knew how to do discreditation attacks on people, and like how to dig up dirt and how to do the kinds of research on, opposing politicians that can help you attack them during elections. If a large intelligence agency devoted a lot of resources to doing that for like every major crypto founder, entrepreneur, major investor, major journalist, podcaster, whatever, and did a kind of rolling, discrediting PSYOP for all the people. And it was like, this person's not paying their child support. This person's a sexual degenerate in some way. This person's doing tax fraud. This, person's into this taboo thing, whatever it is, you can, all of us are imperfect in some way. All of us step outside the Overton window in certain regards. And all of us are vulnerable to that, particularly in an age of mass surveillance. So it's just a question of kind of how long it takes for that to start happening. And we know that nation states play very, very dirty if they feel like they have to when it comes to this stuff. So I think every major figure in crypto should be kind of braced for, the kinds of oppositional attacks that you typically only experience if you're like a major national politician. Because if we really think that the stakes are very, very high in this industry, then opposing stakeholders who, have an interest in the legacy finance systems are sooner or later going to realize that and will coordinate to stop it.
So you would see it. I mean, the only viable attack vector is this social layer / PSYOP attack. I mean, there may be other ones, but it seems like that would be the most viable, just given Bitcoin's proven robustness to protocol level attacks so far. I agree with that. And this is concerning because it's a very subjective domain, as Szabo might call, wet code. There's not a clear technological or objective way to deal with this. Just out of my own curiosity, I've kind of settled on attacking central banking with inquiry, actually, like just sort of, it's an industry, if you want to call it an industry, a legal monopoly that thrives in the darkness, right? The fact that no one understands central banking is what allows them to rob everyone blind in broad daylight constantly. How many people understand still that printing money is theft? Like, I'd say sub 1% of the population, if I'm having to guess. Yet it's done so brazenly, it's really truly unbelievable when you see it for what it is. Do you think that is a viable countermeasure to this type of PSYOP, is like further discrediting the existing apparatus as they try to discredit Bitcoin or crypto?
No, I don't think it is, because it doesn't really hit the emotional hot buttons that ordinary citizens have available. As you point out, like probably less than 1% of people really understand fiat money printing well enough to understand that inflation is theft of all your dollar-denominated assets. And that's pretty abstract. Even the people who get it are kind of like, yeah, gosh darn it, the government's stealing 4% of my bank account per year. Whereas, the way you fight these sort of psyop narratives is with standard effective PR counter narratives. Like you get attractive, influential people as spokespeople standing up for your technology. People who are already known and respected and loved and, romantically attractive and people who everyone else wants to be like. You have spokespeople, you have organized PR and lobbying efforts. And also, crucially, I think you don't prematurely make enemies of institutions that are too dumb to realize that they're actually your enemy. I think at this point, central banking knows crypto is an existential threat. But there's all this other legacy finance system, Wall Street and mainstream banking and insurance and real estate. And all those people kind of don't understand crypto well enough to yet know, is crypto going to help us or hurt us? And they're kind of standing on the sidelines waiting to see how the lines get drawn. And they don't even know there's a war brewing. If crypto preemptively says, okay, all you guys doing tax preparation, all you people working in the insurance industry, all of you real estate brokers, you're going to be out of a job as soon as we put all real estate transactions and contracts on the blockchain. Please don't do that. Don't give them advance warning that they should organize their already existing powerful, well-funded lobbying groups to fight crypto. I think we should just shut up about that for like 10 years and create some uncertainty, about which of those industries are really going to end up being our friends or foes.
Interesting.
As long as they're not sure, they're going to hedge their bets,
Yeah.
We want those real estate agents to be buying Bitcoin and ETH and ADA and whatever. And once enough of them do, they're not going to fight crypto.
So there's the being quiet and the Trojan horse strategy in advance of this. I like that. Do you think, one more thing on this topic, so inflation, central banking, a bit too abstract for general sharing. Do you think war, though, I found this to be, I think, the emotional gateway to sharing this narrative of Bitcoin is that it actually defunds the war machine. This seems like kind of a human universal. I think if everyone could vote, hey guys, if we could just have more wars or no more wars, which one would you choose? I know that's very binary, but I think people in general don't like war. So if you start to look at Bitcoin as a money that actually disincentivizes violence, that seems to be like a very compelling narrative. Do you think that's something that's sufficiently emotionally gripping to propel the narrative?
With certain people, sure. With more kind of pacifist men, with a lot of women, with people who are kind of instinctively anti-violence, anti-war, that makes a lot of sense. And at a rational level, almost everybody knows, most large-scale mechanized warfare between nation states is kind of a bad idea, and it's like a negative-sum game. But I think there's still enough kind of ornery people, especially males, especially young males, who are kind of like, yeah, but war's kind of awesome, and conflict is cool, and I love the movie 300, and an anti-war message.
I do love that movie.
And yeah, me too. And an anti-war message is an arrow we should have in our quiver so that we can, if somebody's ever like, oh, crypto's terrible, it's promoting violence, we need to have those talking points ready that here's the connection between being able to print fiat currency and being able to fund a war machine.
Yes.
And here's how that happens throughout the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
But the tricky thing is, like, you don't necessarily want to be telling Americans, okay, if we all adopt Bitcoin, we won't be a strong, capable military power, right? It's very tricky to say this will weaken our nation's sort of hard power strength.
Yeah, that's interesting. I wonder, I mean, I guess you'd have to look at the numbers, but say the US came out today and just said, we're going to start transitioning to Bitcoin. They'd probably do it quietly at first, but so we'd be running the dollar printing machine, we'd be expanding the money supply, acquiring Bitcoin. If that then did invoke this hyper Bitcoinization event, we would be one of the first adopters, assumably. So we'd still be a world superpower after all was said and done. And maybe that's the right way to position it. It's kind of a matter of national security to hold some territory on this network should it succeed. And you don't want to sit down at the table last. Like, the sooner you can sit down at the table, the more advantageous it is to you in a geopolitical way.
I think in a way what might be more compelling to people is kind of talking about a cyber warfare security issue, which is that on the one hand, if you have a legacy finance system that is extremely centralized in a fairly small number of data centers,
very fragile,
and everybody knows where they are, and it's very fragile, and like even a very limited cyber attack on stock trading institutions or the Fed or this or that data center could wipe out your bank account, cripple the economy, lead you to be unemployed, mean international trade grinds to a halt. People have seen enough kind of cyber terrorism movies for the last 25 years that I think that's a feasible worry. And if you could make the case that secure decentralized crypto can help protect everybody and kind of harden the whole country against those kind of cyber attack vectors, I think that could be a fairly compelling pitch. Particularly if you point out how certain rivals on the geopolitical stage, what are they investing their money in terms of their potential attack vectors on different countries.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually, to really highlight one of the strengths of Bitcoin. Interesting. So maybe we'll pivot back to virtue signaling here. I did really enjoy that tangent, though. I'll read another excerpt here. So you say some of a potential mate's moral virtues could function as signals that maximize one's payoffs and minimize one's risk in relationship games. For example, moral capacities for conscientiousness and patience may signal a partner's likelihood of playing mutually beneficial strategies given the iterated, meaning repeated interaction, nature of long-term relationships. Moral capacities for empathy and sympathy may signal that a partner attaches positive utility to one's own happiness in addition to their own, which makes it much more likely that a Pareto-optimal, which is to say mutually beneficial, equilibrium will be maintained in the relationship. So these signals they're purely for romantic fitness, or I think you said in the beginning that they're not purely for romantic, but I'm having actually a hard time seeing how they're not. Because it seems like if the sole aim of life is like reproduction, then you'd almost cater all of your messages towards that aim to some extent. Was that you trying to kind of just be humble in your thesis here? Or, I mean, this seems pretty strong point that it would be the majority of it, at least.
I've certainly spent 35 years of my research career thinking about sexual relationships as absolutely central to human life and reproduction and evolution. But on occasion, people have been like, Miller, you're too sex obsessed. What about friendship and family and the greater social good and blah, blah, blah. So I try to be balanced in that approach. I do think that the role of moral virtues within intimate long-term relationships has been relatively neglected in moral philosophy. So I'm kind of making a pitch for like, we should at least pay a little more attention to it and not just think about the kind of public morality between strangers that tends to be emphasized by a lot of moral philosophers. And also you'll note the language I used in a lot of that paper was basically like trying to explain to kind of aspie academics in technical terms, things that are kind of intuitively obvious to a lot of normies. Okay. So it's like, to a lot of people, it's obvious, oh, you want to choose a nice mate because they're going to be nice to you over the long term, and that will be good for both of you. Well, if you wrap that up in kind of game theoretic language, I'm just sort of selling it to a certain market segment of my academic readers with that. But I also really enjoy personally kind of digging a little bit beneath the surface and going, okay, we have these intuitions that, oh yeah, we fall in love with nice people.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Well, why? Why? Right. And in particular, given that there's sometimes trade-offs, like people are often attracted to kind of, women are attracted to bad boys and men are sometimes attracted to kind of crazy women. Okay, how does that work? And what are the possible pros and cons of people with different personality traits or different moral virtues and vices?
Yes.
And also, this is intended partly for college students to read. And college students tend to be a little bit short-term in their thinking about relationships. They're not typically tuned into how will this person's traits perhaps play out over a multi-decade marriage that involves kids and grandkids.
Yeah.
They're not really tuned into that time span of decision making.
Right. Yeah, I think earlier you were talking about the meat provisioning, that the great hunter that brings back a bunch of meat and shares it amongst his tribe. He may not even be conceiving of that as something to improve his fitness, right? It's I guess the motivation doesn't necessarily have to map directly onto the evolutionary motivation, if you will. I thought this was interesting too, how you distinguish between moral persons and moral acts, and that the individual, operating in this domain is actually looking at the individual. I can't remember if it was the act or the actor that they were zeroing in on more. I guess it was the individual act, right? Versus all of these morals being contained in a single person. So I'll read one more excerpt here to launch on that, because that too seemed to be like a much higher resolution way to look at the world versus trying to put all of these attributes in the container of one person. And it's kind of like a label, right? You would just say that, oh, that's a good person or a bad person. And then that really discredits the reality that we're all a little bit of both and we change over time and everything's complicated. So the excerpt, you say, costly signaling theory portrays human moral actions in a new light as reliable cues of personal moral traits. This may seem a peculiar idea to most moral philosophers who have traditionally focused on judging the morality of isolated acts rather than the moral virtues of whole people. Recently, as act ethics has been supplanted by virtue ethics, attention has returned to the moral person level of description, just the right level of description to consider in costly signaling models of moral evolution. It is the level that unifies the quantitative traits in evolutionary genetics, mate choice in evolutionary biology, person perception in social psychology, personality traits and behavior genetics, parole decisions in criminal justice, and voter choice in democratic elections. So we see this morality propagating through all layers of human existence in a lot of ways. How did you differentiate that? Like, where did this model come from? The separation between acts and persons, and maybe you could just give us a little bit of background on it.
Yeah, I mean, I know a little bit about moral philosophy and a little bit about its history, but I'm not an expert. But basically, historically, there's been kind of three main branches of moral philosophy. There's deontology, which says there's kind of absolute rules that you should never violate, no matter what the benefits of violating them would be. Like Immanuel Kant, a lot of religious traditions say, look, these are the rules, you must obey them. You should not be doing sort of online calculations about, is it good in this case? Like, follow the rules. The second branch is utilitarian ethics, greatest happiness for the greatest number, where you try to calculate, if I do this versus that, what are the kind of downstream implications in terms of how does it affect people in general and animals? And you try to calculate those expected utilities across the whole world. Now, I'm very sympathetic to that as a normative ethical perspective, and that underlies my interest in effective altruism as a movement, et cetera, and animal ethics. Oops, getting all animated here. And the third branch is virtue ethics, going back to Aristotle, that says it's really individual humans who are the repository of virtues or vices, and that your job as a person is not just to try to make the best individual moral choices day by day that you can, but to cultivate virtue, across all the domains of your life so that you become a better person and you encourage other people to do the same. That last thing, virtue ethics, I think is descriptively how we actually interact with other people and judge them. I think that's like you meet somebody and you're trying to figure out, are they a good person? And you start gathering information about their values and their behaviors and their habits and, their perspectives and their priorities. And each little bit of information you get helps give you a more accurate mental model about how are they going to behave, not just with me, but with my kids and my friends and my colleagues and, everybody. And I think this is quite a natural way that everybody who lives in the real world, has to deal with people. If you're an entrepreneur and you're trying to figure out who to hire and fire as part of your team, it all boils down to like the competence and the ethics of the people, around you. When you're evaluating a politician in a democratic society, you're kind of evaluating the complete moral package, including not just their stated public policies, but also like their private life and their family life and their business dealings and all that. And it's all considered relevant, for better or worse. If you're a professor trying to select which of these 20 grad students do I want to admit to my program to work with me for the next 4 or 5 years
right
in my lab group, you're trying to, assess how smart are they, what are their personality traits, how hardworking are they, but also, are they going to fake data? Are they going to betray colleagues? Do they have scientific ethics and interpersonal ethics? So I think this is quite a natural way that we think about human morality.
Yeah, so it's all sort of like Austrian economics would say that the individual is the elementary particle of the economy in a way, and you're applying that to this moral framing as well, versus instead of just the individual acts, it's like we ultimately have to evaluate the individual, which is a composite of all these acts across time. That's interesting. So you get into this this is maybe kind of a long excerpt. I'll read two different parts here, because you're saying that there are basically two key differences, and I guess this is between the act-based versus individual-based moral action. So the first excerpt says, a moral act may be one that obeys some rationally defensible, universalizable, diatonic, or consequentialist principle. However, a moral person, from the point of view of a standard prehistoric hunter-gatherer, is someone who embodies pro-social virtues that make them a good mate, friend, relative, or trading partner. In evolutionary terms, a moral person is simply one who pursues their ultimate genetic self-interest through psychological adaptations that embody a genuine, proximate concern for others. So it gets very close. Competence and virtue almost start to overlap in this framework. Is that right?
Yeah, they do. And this is a very uncomfortable concept to a lot of people living under modernity, where we've tried to pry apart kind of competence versus virtue, or like intelligence versus ethics, or we've tried very hard to sort of say, like, even if you suck at everything, you can be a highly ethical person. Mm-hmm. And in a way, I think that's kind of lying to ourselves about how we actually interact with other people. Because I think in our day-to-day dealings, like if I'm collaborating with someone on a scientific paper, the line between them being like incompetent at managing their time versus being like unethically careless about how they analyze their data or write it up, that's a very fuzzy line. If you're in a marriage, like the line between someone just being like incompetent at watching over your kids and keeping them safe versus them being like evil and neglectful, very fuzzy line. The line between, an employee who makes so many mistakes that they wreck your business versus someone who like steals money and wrecks your business, it doesn't much matter to you as a boss. The outcome might be kind of the same.
Yeah.
So I think if you go back to the ancient Greeks, or even like the Nietzschean concept of kind of like master morality versus slave morality, or the pagan virtues that Aristotle talked about, in that perspective, competence is pretty highly correlated with morality, because people who are competent and moral can bring sustained real benefits to you if you interact with them.
Right.
You remember the scene from 300 where King Leonidas is talking to the hunchback guy, right? Yeah. And the hunchback guy really, really wants to help with the fighting.
Yeah,
and Leonidas points out, like, you can't raise your shield. You can't protect the guy next to you.
Yes.
I'm sorry, you're not capable of doing that. And that, I mean, it's cosmically unfair.
Yes.
But for the good of, the army, like, there's not really any difference between not being willing to protect the guy next to you and not being able to do it.
Right. Yeah. And
so, yeah,
he made, and to further make it ambivalent, was he had a great thrust, right? He had a great stabbing maneuver, but he couldn't lift his shield to protect the man next to him. Therefore, he couldn't fit into the army. I think the example you gave in your book was, if you go on a date with someone that has Tourette's and they're shouting some obscenity, that even though you understand that they may have a psychological disorder, this is not something that they can help, it's very unlikely there's going to be a second date, right? There's an incompetence there that it doesn't so much matter that the intention didn't map to it. It was just the actual physical embodiment of it.
Yeah.
So I want to read this second excerpt, which I thought was interesting too. You said, second, the moral person level emphasizes that perceived moral virtue is an emergent property of interaction between the moral judgment maker and the morally judged. just as beauty arises from the sexual ornaments of the displayer interacting with the perceptual adaptations of the beholder. Beauty is neither subjective nor objective, but what one could call objectively relational. It is a real emergent property of a costly signaling system, including both ornaments and preferences. Likewise, for moral virtues, in this mate choice model, the morality emerges from the interaction of traits and preferences. I mean, amazingly put. I'd never considered morality as an emergent property. And this gets to, again, back to Rothbard. I think he talks about reason in the same way, right? Like human reason is an objective feature of humans or faculty of humans. Although it deals with value judgments or subjective judgments. I mean, again, I'm getting to his book. I don't have the exact answer. What I think he's arguing is that because we have an objective reasonableness, we can get to an objective ethic or natural law that would be most conducive to human flourishing. Is that something similar here where you're saying that, because a lot of, especially postmodernism, will just say morals are purely relativistic, right? You're just kind of picking your own code arbitrarily and sticking to it. But I think you're somewhat making the point here that that's not quite the case. It's not purely subjective or purely objective. It's something in between.
Yeah, I think, the whole dichotomy between subjective and objective is very often misleading because almost all human life operates somewhere in the middle ground.
Right.
But it's not a vague, waffly middle ground. It's actually kind of a surprisingly precise middle ground. So if you say, for example, let's go back to the Airbnb ratings. Are they objective? Well, if the compilation of an average Airbnb rating by a guest is mathematically truly reflective of real guests rating how well they like this particular place to live for a while, that's also kind of objectively relational, right? They're reporting like, for me, given my needs, like I need space and I need Wi-Fi and I need a kitchen that works and I need a quiet neighborhood. For me, this is a good fit and I rate this Airbnb on that basis.
Yeah.
Right. And then you compile those judgments and, as long as your needs as a potential renter are more or less aligned with like the typical needs of other renters historically, then you can take that rating as like a reliable, objectively relational measure of how happy you're likely to be in that place.
Right. Yeah.
So is it subjective? Is it objective? Well, it's useful information.
Right.
And that's good enough. And I think an awful lot of social judgment and moral judgment has that kind of character.
Yeah. Again, we get back to this market dynamic where, so a market is supply, demand. Supply, pretty objective feature of reality, right? There's only a certain amount of capital or water, whatever the thing is being bought and sold. Demand, subjective. How much do people want of it? You overlay these two quantities, you get price, right? It's like an emergent property of, or what you may call objectively relational, right? The price is objectively relational for market actors. And it seems like there's something deeper here. I've really been getting so interested in the concept of exchange because it seems like everything is exchange. Like the whole universe is this market of interchange. And so exchange, at least in the market sense, it's where like the narrative or the realm of relevance maybe in reality touches physical material reality, right? And we are I don't have the words for it. It's where the ideological plane and the physical plane touch. It seems like something like that. And so morality, I guess you'd be arguing here, is emerging from the interaction of ornaments which is a supply feature, I guess, right? There's only a certain number of animals with certain ornamentation, whether it's horns or bright feathers, whatever it may be, and the preferences of their prospective sexual partners, which is demand. So is that what there's another marketplace dynamic occurring here?
Oh yeah, totally. So this is where you get virtue signaling dynamics at the cultural level, right? Where, for example, you get historical trends in what's considered kind of a minimum acceptable level of morality in a partner, right? And often, historically, what you see is that like middle-class women are often the ones to kind of raise the ethical standard of a whole civilization. So, for example, in Victorian England, there was the anti-vivisection movement, and women got very distressed that certain scientists were like cutting open living dogs and cats and trying to figure out how they work. And they're like, this is bad, this hurts these animals, we object to it. And they organized anti-vivisection movements. And they managed to convince enough men, like, you will not be acceptable as a potential mate if you don't support me in this ethical quest. And then the same thing happened largely with anti-slavery movement, right? Or anti-drinking movements. You kind of get the moral bar being raised higher and higher, often kind of through the mating market and the marriage market. And nowadays with social media, of course, you get ethical standards, arising very, very quickly. And you get this kind of ethical churn where like views that were considered okay 3 years ago are suddenly like taboo and considered completely outdated. And now you have to start adopting this new ethical standard or this new ethical signal, this new kind of virtue signaling in order to be acceptable on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. And I think it's very hard to make sense of those kinds of social media dynamics unless you have a really clear sense of how virtue signaling works at a kind of psychological level.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So, okay, so morality, the rules of the game for the social network, whatever it may be, we're constantly trying to play within them, and we want those around us to play within them so we can lower our own cognitive burden to deal with uncertainty, whatever the aim we're trying to achieve. And then in that game, I guess, if that's the right term, that sexual selection is almost like a tool used to guide our own evolution, right? Like if the group's going astray, then enough people in that group, well, you're saying women, which I guess Peterson makes this point a lot too, that female apes they don't discriminate in their mating preferences. They kind of will just, in terms of the hierarchy, they'll just sleep with any male and at any position in the hierarchy. Whereas human females are very selective. They want to always date across and up. At least in the socioeconomic hierarchy, I think was what he was talking about. Whereas men will date across and down. So then sexual selection becomes a tool by which we guide our own evolution, which is really interesting. Kind of like innovation in a way, where we're using a tool to guide ourselves, to guide ourselves a different direction, right? We can, instead of walking everywhere, we can start driving, and then maybe we evolve different features as a result of that, or create cities, et cetera, et cetera. This feels like something that we're touching on something that really distinguishes human from animal, like this agency of sexual partner, of tool use. Is that what this is? It's connected to our reason, I suppose.
I think it is. It's unusually human to put so much of our sexual selection and mate choice focus on these kind of ethical attributes. Right. So if you're a peacock, and you're being chosen by a peahen, it's basically just the morphology of your tail. How big is it? How colorful? How symmetrical? How can you shake it? And the peahen's like, oh, cool tail, bad, like not very good tail. They're not making an probably not making a like ethical judgment about that's a virtuous tale and that's an evil tale because it's small and ugly. But I think once you get a kind of hyper-social primate like us that's so well adapted to living in a family and tribal group setting, and where you've got language and memory and planning, and you can integrate information about someone across long spans of time and many interactions, then you suddenly have this leverage for shaping the evolution of all kinds of behaviors, cooperative behaviors and mating and parenting behaviors, where you never really had that much leverage before.
Right.
Like even if chimps wanted to select for, you know, good virtue signaling chimps, there's only a limited number of ways they could do that.
Yeah.
You know, the female chimps could potentially select for male chimps that are better at leading effective raids against other chimp tribes. They could select for like alpha males that are better at resolving conflict within the chimp group.
Right.
They could select for males that are better at reducing like accidental infanticides and baby deaths, you know, and stuff like that. But they wouldn't have the range of social interactions that we have by virtue of exchange and language and all that they could pay attention to. And I think selecting for these moral virtues has been an incredibly creative evolutionary process, because it means like you can take, let's say, women choosing men for their trustworthiness and for like the integrity of following through on their promises. And if you start favoring that in your male mates, then kind of as a byproduct, you're selecting males who also have a sense of honor and integrity when they're dealing with their friends and allies and customers and the broader market, you know?
Yeah.
So you get all these kind of generalized social benefits out of this kind of sexual selection for moral virtues, I think. And that, I think that was actually crucial in, you know, the rise of human civilizations and market economies and technology.
Yeah.
That we kind of had probably thousands of generations of selection, you know, males choosing females, females choosing males, for these kinds of like mating virtues that then happen to be really also useful when you're interacting with strangers in markets that involve, you know, billions of people.
Fascinating. Sort of bootstrapping reciprocal altruism all the way up into the market economy, right?
Yeah.
It's an incredible way to look at it. And so I like the point you made there too. It's because we have the capacity to cooperate at scale, you know, largely via the use of symbols, you know, language and numeracy, all these psychotechnologies, again, that other animals don't have the ability to use, that we have more exchange. What we say here? This gets into like Yuval Harari's book Sapiens, whereas like the reason humans run the world is because we can mobilize 10,000 people under a flag, right? We can mobilize people under a symbol, whereas a primate troop cannot do that. They can't break the Dunbar number of 150 or whatever it may be. And so morality is almost a reflection of our exchange complexity. So the fact that we can exchange across larger scales of space and time, the morality has to match that in a way, right? It becomes more sophisticated, nuanced, and all of these things. So interesting. So morality is an emergent market phenomenon, but there's a truth to it, just like there's a truth to price, right? It's not just some hand wavy subjective thing. It's like, no, there's a functional and non-functional morality, or a true and untrue in a given market, I guess you could say. Yeah, a lot to think about there. I want to read one more excerpt here that I thought was super cool, because I had never heard of the Pagan Virtues, actually. So you say the most romantic personal traits are often those that have been considered praiseworthy moral virtues by the world's most influential philosophical and religious traditions from ancient Greece, Israel, Arabia, India, China, and Japan. These lovable virtues include not only the traditional pro-social virtues of European Christendom, such as faith, hope, charity, love, kindness, fairness, equality, humility, and conscience, but also Nietzsche's pagan virtues, such as leadership, bravery, strength, skill, health, fertility, beauty, tolerance, joy, humor, and grace. Can you speak to that dichotomy? This is the first I'd ever heard of it, but it's just very interesting.
Yeah, so after you guys listen to this, you should all go read, Nietzsche's The Genealogy of Morals, which is an amazing, groundbreaking book from, the 1800s, where Nietzsche is sort of critiquing the whole history of Western moral philosophy ever since Christ, and pointing out that a lot of what we consider kind of abstractly ethical is actually very much grounded in a particular kind of Judeo-Christian ethic as it developed historically in Europe, right? And he's pointing out there's a lot of things that people used to consider virtuous in pre-Christian pagan traditions and in other cultures, and even in Northern Europe as it was getting gradually Christianized. Like the Vikings spent hundreds of years kind of being in the borderline between we worship Thor, but we also worship Jesus. And, and they kind of combined those pagan virtues and the Christian virtues. So I'm just pointing out that I think actually a distinctive problem with current moral psychology is it puts way too much emphasis on those Christian virtues that are frankly kind of feminine in a way, like they're more stereotypically associated with women. And they kind of neglect the pagan virtues that stereotypically and historically were a little bit more masculine virtues, the kind of virtues you see in the movie 300 or Fight Club or whatever, and that are very sexually attractive to many women, but that many modern men fail to cultivate. So the wrong way to read my little chapter or journal paper here would be to go, oh, I'm a young man, I want to be sexually attractive, I'm going to be ethical in the style of just Jesus or just Buddha or just the kind of pacifist, egalitarian, nice, Mr. Nice Guy morality, right? I think that would be kind of a blunder, because it means you're handicapping yourself from showing all those traditional pagan virtues that are actually some of the hottest kind of sexually attractive virtues, particularly early in courtship, right? Those are the kind of virtues that young males strive to show off in many cultures kind of before they settle down and get married. And then once you have babies, you'll naturally moderate those and kind of become nicer and more chill, and you won't be worried so much about the honor of battle and strength and all that. But I do think there's a kind of sexual politics element to this, and I was slightly anticipating my mate book. This is a little bit of gentle advice to my male readers that dudes, don't neglect the pagan virtues as you're cultivating your ethical soul.
Would you say, where's the line between these two? Because it seems like faith, hope, charity, love, kindness, fairness, equality, humility, conscience, those seem to be pretty selfless. Whereas these other ones, I guess you could say they're the pagan are maybe a little more selfish: leadership, bravery, strength, skill, health, fertility, beauty, tolerance, joy, humor, grace. Maybe that's not the right way to distinguish between the two. Are these just ones that are mentioned in the Bible versus ones that Nietzsche laid out, or is there some categorical difference between the two?
I'm basically just borrowing from Nietzsche at that point, but
Mm-hmm.
and so the line is a little bit arbitrary, but I think in a way, a lot of the pagan virtues honestly have to do with cultivating your family or group power so that it can defend itself against potentially hostile other groups.
Mm.
You know, so the virtues of being able to be like a decisive military leader, like Patton, are not particularly kind and cuddly,
Mm-hmm.
but there's, you know, there are really good reasons for being like you need the guys who can do that, or else your group
Right.
ends up being defenseless and goes
Right.
extinct. So when you're dealing with existential threats to your family or your tribe, that's often when these pagan virtues become absolutely crucial.
Right.
And during peacetime, you kind of forget that they actually have any utility, and there's a kind of drift into like, oh, the Christian virtues are all we need.
Mm.
And then you get an actual threat, and then you go, oh, I guess we should have kept the balance a little more strongly. And you know, to some extent, this maps onto a kind of right versus left political spectrum. To some extent, it maps a little bit onto masculine versus feminine virtues. But I think at a more abstract level, it just points out that like there's many different ways you can provide value to your group.
Yeah.
And not all of them involve being a psychotherapist who's a good listener.
Right.
You know.
Yeah. So it's situational, right? In times of war, you need more of the pagan virtues, perhaps, and in times of peace, the Christian virtues are a little more fitting. This is calling to mind, I don't know if it's related, but Carl Jung and the shadow work is there's almost I guess the highest form of development then would be integrating these two together so that you have all of these within one individual.
Yeah. And I think like every ethically mature civilization has kind of realized this, and it's always provided little nudges to individuals as they're growing up that like you need to integrate a little bit more of this, you need to work a little bit more on this other thing, and then you become a truly balanced, integrated, flexible, adaptive person. And it's also recognized that functional civilizations have recognized you need also a diversity of different kind of ethical personality types, just different kinds of people.
Yeah.
And you shouldn't expect everyone to kind of converge onto like one ethical type that like solves all your problems. You basically need all these different Jungian archetypes, the warrior and the trickster and the, wise old man and etc. And so each individual can try to integrate all these archetypes internally, but also like you're allowed to specialize.
Yeah. Is then the king or the ruler of the polity, they're supposed to embody this integration as much as possible?
I mean, to the extent that, let's say you have a monarch who's expected to rule for multiple decades, where you have like wartime and peacetime, and you have, economic boom times, and then you have hard times. And like if you want the same person to be able to be a functional ruler throughout all of those contexts, then hopefully they're going to integrate all these parts into themselves. Or you could run it like a Roman Republic, where like the guy that you need in peacetime isn't necessarily the guy you need when you're at war with Carthage. Then you appoint the despot, like, and then hopefully they give up their power once the war's over.
Pretty low odds on that one, right?
It works sometimes.
Yeah.
And, you know, I guess arguably one advantage of crypto is like you don't necessarily need like a one leader who either integrates all of these attributes and sort of runs the network like a CEO. And you might actually have a benefit from having a kind of variety of different personality and moral types involved in any given project. You know.
A less hierarchical marketplace, perhaps, which I think that is one of the very interesting aspects of Bitcoin, is that since you have the property rights imbued in the asset, they don't really need to be protected by some enforcer outside that may or may not give up his powers or abuse his powers. That it at least portends the possibility of a leaderless civilization in a way. Not leaderless like none, but less people sitting on tops of hierarchies. So flatter hierarchies all around. That is probably a good place to stop. I think I'm really captivated by the book, frankly.
Thanks.
This idea, because it's a complicated argument, but it's very important in the world today, that it feels like the world is kind of awash in moral relativism. And that's what's just disintegrating culture and society. You know, again, I'm still trying to more precisely identify what I intuit to be a link to money. And not just me, many authors have written about this. You know, you earn more money, it tends to earn more social morality, and has all these second and third order consequences. But I feel like this lens of evolutionary biology is helping bridge that gap in my own understanding. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Hope we can talk again soon. And thank you guys for listening to a long and winding conversation. I really enjoyed it, though.
That's what they're here for, hopefully.